I want to focus on chapter 3 in this lecture. So in chapter 3, we have Pip running back to the marshes to give the file and the food that he has stolen, to give it to the prisoner. And I want you to notice the setting that we get here. Dickens is fond of using settings to kind of set atmosphere, portray the mood, okay? So we get the marshes, which is, kind of just a grassy area or whatever. So on page 15, when we read it at the beginning of chapter 3, he's kind of describing it. I'm going to skip ahead to the second paragraph. The mist was heavier yet when I got out upon the marshes, so that, I'm going to just tell you something here. Actually, I'll go back a little bit. Okay. So he goes outside. On every rail and gate, wet lay clammy, and the marsh mist was so thick that the wooden finger on the post directing people to our village, a direction which they never accepted, for they never came there, was invisible to me until I was quite close under it. Then as I looked up at it, while it dripped, it seemed to my oppressed conscience like a phantom devoting me to the hulks. The hulks is a reference to the prisoner ships, okay? So he kind of gets these sort of apparitions, like these, visions of seeing things all the time, and it's mostly driven by his guilty conscience, okay? So then he's going, and the mist was heavier yet when I got out upon the marshes, so that instead of my running at everything, everything seemed to run at me. This was very disagreeable to a guilty mind. The gates and dikes and banks came bursting at me through the mist, as if they cried as plainly as could be, "A boy with somebody else's pork pie! Stop him!" And so he goes on. But, the whole thing with this kind of foggy marsh that we'll see appear a few times in the novel, that it's sort of symbolizing danger, that there's going to be, something that's going to happen that is going to impact Pip's life, okay? So watch for that and see how Dickens uses setting and atmosphere. Not just here, there's other settings in the novel that are really key to understanding the novel, okay? I also want to point something else that we'll pick up on later. On page 16, Pip refers to times where they've, sat at the battery. A battery is just sort of an old armory kind of a place. So there'd be, whatever you use for armory, I don't know, like cannons or something like that. Okay, and he's sitting on there, and it says, and this is on page 16, the first full paragraph. I knew my way to the battery pretty straight, for I'd been down there on a Sunday with Joe, and Joe, sitting on an old gun, had told me that when I was prenticed to him regularly bound, we would have such larks there. And I just wanted to point this out because we know that that Joe is a blacksmith. I think we know that already. Anyway, he's a blacksmith, and the intention is that Pip is going to apprentice under him and become a blacksmith. And this is going to be great. Joe thinks this is wonderful. Pip is great. This is all good. Okay. So in chapter 2 or 3, we learned that there are 2 escaped convicts, right? And when Pip first comes across whom he thinks is his convict, it's not. So then he goes and finds his. When he tells the one that he later refers to as my convict about seeing the other one, the first convict is irate and like he is just desperate to get away. So at the end of chapter 3, we leave him filing and filing to get that chain off of his ankle and presumably pursue the other convict. In chapter 4, we meet more of Dickens' bizarre characters. Here we meet Mr. Wopsle and Mr. Pumblechook. Now, Dickens often gives his characters ridiculous and whimsical names. Like we have Mr. Bumble and Oliver Twist. We have Mr. Gradgrind and what's another one? Machokum Child, both in Hard Times. All kinds. We have Flint Witch in Little Dorrit, a number of them. Oh yeah, Fezziwig in Scrooge, or in Christmas Carol. Okay, so he likes these kinds of crazy characters, but he also, often, as I said, gives these larger-than-life characters. So Mr. Pumblechook, also known as Uncle Pumblechook, but only to Mrs. Joe, not to Joe, whom, in fact, is Mr. Pumblechook's nephew. But he is arrogant, he's pompous, he's a loudmouth, a hypocrite, He and Mrs. Joe are allies in beating down poor Bip and Joe, and and people are always kind of flattering him, or they're buying into his self-flattery, and yet Dickens kind of wants us to know that those people are idiots, right? The sergeant, for example, we see him just like tripping over himself to flatter Pumblechook, but I think that the suggestion is it's mostly for free booze. So Pumblechook we're going to come across numerous times, and he is going to at times get put in his place, but continue to be this incredibly pompous character, Donald Trump, if you like. Then we have Mr. Wopsle, who loves to talk, and he wants to be this great orator. He loves to read poetry, read plays, act in plays, read the newspaper. He's always, orating. He's always, up there speaking, but never really is given. That's not really formally what he does. He's a clerk for the church, but he imagines that, he would be the best preacher. So he's always talking about whatever the sermon was, he would have done it so much better. And he just loves to hear himself talk, okay? And, he is also going to come to some unfortunate sort of being like kind of humiliated. It's going to be amusing. Okay, and they're so rude to Pip. Like, they tell him that he's naturally vicious, or vicious, I think is how they say it. He's naturally vicious, and he's just this incredibly horrible, evil child. Let's see here. I wanted to read on page 23. Okay, we dined, my sister, Curly, I don't know what. Okay. The second full paragraph down the page. Not because I was, okay, so among this good company, I should have felt myself, even if I hadn't rubbed the pantry in a false position. Not because I was squeezed in at an acute angle of the tablecloth with the table in my chest and the Pumblechookian elbow in my eye, nor because I was not allowed to speak, I didn't want to speak, nor because I was regaled with the scaly tips of the drumsticks of the fowls and with those obscure corners of pork of which the pig, when living, had the least reason to be vain. No, I should not have minded that if they would only have left me alone. But they wouldn't leave me alone. They seemed to think the opportunity lost if they failed to point the conversation at me every now and then and stick the point into me. I might have been an unfortunate little bull in a Spanish arena. I got so smartingly touched up by these moral goads. So, do you hear that? Be grateful. Especially be grateful, boy, to them which brought you up by and... Why is it that the young are never grateful? Naturally vicious. It means everybody, true. And, they just go on and absolutely, demean and berate him. So that's how he's treated by pretty much all adults, except for Joe is so lovely. So then we have the sergeant coming, and the police knock at the door. Again, Pip is freaking out. Are they after me? I don't know. But know that there have been escaped convicts, and they're going to go after them. And so then Joe and Pip and Mr. Wopsle kind of, follow along. They meet up with the convicts, who are both fighting each other. So, and Pip refers to, the convict he first encountered as my convict. And so, Pip is very concerned when he sees the convict. Is the convict gonna sell him out for stealing the, food and the file? But the convict sacrifices his, or actually totally remains loyal, and doesn't even give him up, right? And so it's really this act of benevolence on the part of the convict. He also, rather than fleeing, because he could have fled, because he got hit the file to get his chains off, he stayed to make sure that other convict is brought back onto the prison ship, so he sacrifices his own freedom to ensure that the other convict is arrested, which is very interesting. Like, why would you stick around to see the other convict arrested, knowing that you're going to be arrested as well? You either are like incredibly stupid, or maybe you are just hoping that they'll let you go. I don't know, right? But there's something that's driving this convict to stick around. Okay, And then at the last chapter, I told you how he kind of has these apparitions and these really crazy sort of scenes here. So I want to look on page 37. Oh, actually, I'm skipping ahead a bit here. Okay, yeah, so we've got the chapter 5, so I'm going to skip ahead to page 37, the last chapter, or the last bit here of chapter 6. Um, the something that I had noticed before clicked in the man's throat again, and he turned his back. The boat had returned, and his guard were ready, so we followed him to the landing place made of rough stakes and stones, and saw him put into the boat, which was rowed by a crew of convicts like himself. No one seemed surprised to see him, or interested in seeing him, or glad to see him, or sorry to see him, or spoke a word, except that somebody in the boat growled as if to dogs, "Give way, you!" which was the signal for the dip of the oars. By the light of the torches we saw the black hulk lying out a little way from the mud of the shore, like a wicked Noah's Ark, cribbed and barred and moored by massive rusty chains. The prison ship seemed in my young eyes to be ironed like the prisoners. We saw the boat go alongside, and we saw him taken up the side and disappear. Then the ends of the torches were flung hissing into the water and went out as if it were all over with him. Notice the language in here, the chains, irons, prisoners. Again, all of these references throughout the novel to these, symbols of imprisonment, oppression, being trapped. And notice how the ship kind of just disappears in this really ominous, mysterious way, sort of like the Flying Dutchman or something, right? But there's this like incredible finality that, as if it were all over with him. That's it, Pip gonna wash his hands of that convict, but no, not so much.